Now, we want to pick up where we left off in our discussion of bone growth. And when we're considering long bone growth, longitudinal growth occurs at the borders that are defined by the epiphyseal plates, which is a remnant of hyaline cartilage left behind at the end of development. Remember that originally the skeleton is made exclusively out of hyaline cartilage, and it transitions to mineralized matrix in the process of endochondral ossification prior to birth, and the epiphyseal plate will persist until the end of puberty, and once that disappears, that's the end of longitudinal growth, and then the only type of bone growth possible after that is appositional growth or changes in bone density. This involves the formation of new cartilage by interstitial cartilage growth and appositional growth on the surface of the cartilage. The closure of the epiphyseal plate usually happens between 12 and 25 years of age, and at that point that cartilage population has been replaced entirely by a bone scar that's made primarily out of spongy bone. Articular cartilage does not normally ossify and will persist throughout life to pad and protect the diarthrotic joints, the sites of articulation between, for instance, long bones, such as the femur and the tibia, or the humerus and the radius and ulna. Appositional growth is only it changes in terms of the width of the bone. It can't occur because the matrix in this case is solid. It occurs on old bone and also on the cartilage surface. This is very important to understand because as you apply force to bone, one of the things that happens is that it's going to adjust to the applied force by increasing bone density where the force is applied, and this is an adaptation to stimuli. And this is one of the reasons why if you engage in moderate exercise into old age, you're going to forestall the emergence of a condition known as osteoporosis. What you're looking at here is just a peek at the epiphyseal plate at the ends of the long bones here. You can see these different zones as defined by the differential staining. In zone 1, you've got new cartilage that's being generated on the epiphyseal side of the epiphyseal plate. So this is the side closest to either the proximal or the distal head. As the chondrocytes divide, they form stacks of cells, and you can actually see them there with their purple staining nuclei. In zone 2, the chondrocytes get larger, so this is an area of hypertrophy for this tissue. And then in zone 3, the matrix calcifies, and this cuts off the diffusion of nutrients to the chondrocytes, and as a result they die. In zone 4, this is the diaphyseal side of the epiphyseal plate, and what's happening here is that bone is replacing cartilage, and this process continues again till the end of puberty. And all you're looking at here is just a comparison of what we were looking at in an electron micrograph with an actual diagram, and it's showing you the same set of zones. You can see zone 1, 2, 3, and 4 as we move from epiphyseal side to the diaphyseal side, and you can see the process of chondrocyte reproduction, but also of the replacement of chondrocyte by bone in this transitional area. Now, we should note that during this period of growth where the epiphyseal plates are still viable, it's possible to have a fracture along this zone because it represents a weak spot in the bone, and these are called epiphyseal fractures. They're usually relatively easy to set. You simply have to reduce the fracture, which is to get the ends of the broken bone to set so that they articulate the way they did prior to the break, and then normally everything heals perfectly fine. Okay, now considering articular cartilage, this is the cartilage that's at the ends of the bones in the epiphyses, and this is what pads and protects the joint. We sometimes see an increase in the size of bones that do not have epiphyses, such as short bones, because they're capable of appositional growth, but chondrocytes near the surface of articular cartilage are similar to those in the zone of resting cartilage, meaning that the cells are still alive. The chondrocytes are still embedded in the matrix, but the matrix itself isn't actively thickening. And this is one of the reasons why, if you mistreat a joint by physically abusing it, you can tear away some of this cartilage, and it generally won't grow back. Usually we have to go into the joint and trim away the cartilage that's been wrenched from the surface of the bone, and from that point on, that joint is going to be more vulnerable to a condition known as osteoarthritis, which is generated by having bone hit bone inside the joint capsule, knocking free bone spurs which rattle around inside the joint capsule and inflame it and reduce your range of motion and also produce quite a bit of pain. One of the hallmarks of osteoarthritis is that it usually presents early in the weight-bearing joints, so the hips, the knees, and the ankles often suffer first, and it's exacerbated by conditions such as obesity and pregnancy. Now, the next thing that we want to look at is appositional growth. This is growth in bone width. So just take a peek at this video.
Bones grow through the process of appositional growth, the formation of new bone on the surface of older bone or cartilage. Osteoblasts beneath the periosteum lay down bone to form ridges around a blood vessel. The blood vessel lies in a groove between the ridges. The groove is transformed into a tunnel when the bone built on the adjacent ridges meets. The periosteum of the groove becomes the endosteum of the tunnel. Osteoblasts from the endosteum lay down bone to form a new concentric lamella. The production of additional concentric lamellae fills in the tunnel and completes the formation of a new osteon.
Okay, now what are some of the factors that affect bone growth? Well, the size and the shape of the bone is determined genetically, but it can be modified by nutritional status and also by hormone. Nutrition is important because it supplies the building blocks for bone. Calcium, protein, and other nutrients provide the starting material for generating collagen in the mineralized matrix. The other macronutrients, of course, are used to generate ATP, which drives a lot of this biosynthesis. If we lack any of these components in the bone building stage of our lives, especially prior to the end of puberty, the development of the bones is going to be hindered. Vitamin D is critical because it's important for the absorption of calcium from the intestines. It can be eaten, but it's generally manufactured in the body as a metabolic pathway that involves both the skin, the kidneys, and also the liver. Rickets is the result of a lack of vitamin D during childhood, and what happens is that the bones are extremely soft and easy to malform. Individuals with rickets will often have a abnormal bowing of the long bones, especially those that carry a significant amount of the body's weight. Osteomalacia is a lack of vitamin D during adulthood that leads to a softening of the bones and also, again, to unusual bone shapes. Essentially, when you take away one of the two important building blocks of bone, protein being one and the mineralized salts being the other, you're going to have a loss in structural integrity, and you're going to have problems supporting the force that's applied to the bone, and that's going to cause the shape to change. Vitamin C is important for collagen synthesis by osteoblasts. A lack of vitamin C can lead to a condition known as scurvy, which results in easy bruising and bleeding, but also is going to have a major impact on the skeletal system, causing it to malform. What will happen in scurvy is that the bones will become unnecessarily brittle. This also causes wounds to be slow to heal, teeth to fall out, and also opens the door for a lot more frequent infections. Hormones are critical in bone growth. Growth hormone, human growth hormone, is made by the pituitary gland, and it stimulates interstitial cartilage growth and appositional bone growth. A burst of human growth hormone to an abnormal level before the end of puberty results in a condition that you've probably heard of, which is known as gigantism. So let's just pen that in here so that we know what we're talking about. Okay, and that would be growth hormone increase prior to puberty, prior to the end of puberty. And of course, there's another condition that's related, which is dwarfism, which is a reduction in growth hormone prior to the end of puberty. Okay, so dwarfism. And then there's a third condition which you may not be familiar with, which results from a burst of growth hormone that occurs after the end of puberty, and this is called acromegaly. G-A-L-Y. And individuals with acromegaly have enlarged hands and feet. Their bones, especially their flat bones, thicken quite a bit, so there's a lot of appositional growth that's spurred by the production of human growth hormone. It also produces effects that domino all throughout the other body systems. And there's an excellent video that we'll watch in class about gigantism, um, probably either this week or next week, which shows you how it can affect the nervous system, the cardiopulmonary system, not to mention, of course, the obvious effects on the skeletal system. How do we treat? Well, we treat gigantism by using growth hormone antagonists. For dwarfism, we give growth hormone until the infant reaches normal adult height at the end of puberty. And acromegaly, we treat also with growth hormone antagonists. Human growth hormone, or HGH, is one of those hormones that falls under the category of a PED. Okay, so this is a performance enhancing drug. Athletes use this to get bigger and stronger and faster, and it's one of those things that's routinely screened for. I know in the NFL, I'm not sure about Major League Baseball. It's a little bit hazy what they're doing these days. And in point of fact, we actually consume considerable amounts of bovine growth hormone when we eat processed meats, because it's used in the production of chicken meat and in the production of beef. And the idea is that the growth hormone that's given to these animals causes them to get bigger faster, and as a result you can bring more food to market quicker and make a higher profit. Uh, what happens as a result of consuming this bovine growth hormone is that the mean adult height over the past several decades has been going up and up and up. Um, as an example, okay, um, I'm in my early 50s, and when I was a child, Cincinnati had a basketball team in town called the Cincinnati Royals. They've since become the Sacramento Kings. And back in those days, the mean height for a center in the NBA was 6 feet tall. Okay, and now the mean height for a center in the NBA is over 7 feet, probably about 7 foot 2 inches. And this change in the mean height in the NBA is due primarily to the influence of this bovine growth hormone, as well as improved exercise and training regimens. Uh, Another example of how human growth hormone has affected our mean height has seen in the emergence of a league that didn't even exist when I was younger, called the WNBA. We now have women in the WNBA who can dunk, and that's in part due to their increased strength, but also due to their increased height. And that isn't just genetics; it is this component in the diet. Thyroid hormone is required for growth of all tissues. Thyroid hormone increases the basal metabolic rate, which is essentially the speed with which you oxidize fat and turn it into energy in the form of ATP and heat. Sex hormones such as estrogen and testosterone also stimulate bone growth. They cause bone growth at puberty, but they can also cause closure of the epiphyseal plates and cessation of growth if the hormone amounts are abnormal. And what you're looking at here is just an example of gigantism and dwarfism, and these are, again, errors in the production of human growth hormone that have a profound effect on long bone development. Okay, now bone remodeling is essentially a process that responds to applied force. It converts woven bone into lamellar bone, and it's caused by migration of basic multicellular units. These are groups of osteoclasts and osteoblasts that work as a team to remodel bone. The osteoclasts, of course, are the bone dissolvers, and the osteoblasts are the matrix depositors. Excuse me. They're involved in bone growth, in changes in bone shape, and in adjustments to the bone when you apply stress to it, as well as bone repair and calcium ion regulation. As an example, increased osteoclast activity has the effect of raising blood calcium, while increased osteoblast activity has the effect of reducing it. And remember that calcium is critical not just for mineralizing bone, but it's also important in blood clotting, in muscle contraction, and in nerve transmission, just to name a few. The relative thickness of bone changes as the bone grows. The bone is constantly removed by osteoclasts, and new bone is formed by osteoblasts. And the formation of new osteons in the compact bone will essentially uh, produce changes in the bone structure. The osteoclasts enter the osteon from the blood that's in the reversion canal, and they internally remove lamellae, and then the osteoblasts replace the bone that's been removed by the osteoclast. And so you can imagine a family of osteons at the periphery of a long bone, and essentially what the osteoclasts do is they drill it out from the center, and then the osteoblasts can come in and redeposit brand new osteons in the area that's been essentially dissolved by the osteoclasts. So that's essentially how the remodeling works. And all you're looking at here is just a diagram showing you how it is that bone remodeling happens. You can see here the epiphyses of a long bone, the articular cartilage, and notice how the osteoclast and osteoblast combine in order to adjust the stress that's applied to the bone. You can see here cartilage is replaced by bone. There's bone remodeling going on here. Growth in length is continuing because the epiphyseal plate is still present. And remember here that cartilage is being replaced by bone. Eventually what happens is that this longitudinal ossification catches up with the production of these new chondroblasts, and the epiphyseal plate will disappear, becoming now the epiphyseal line, which you can see here marking the junction between the epiphysis of the long bone and then this neck here, which is called the metaphysis, and then the shaft, which we call the diaphysis. Bone growth in the appositional orientation is also accomplished, of course, by the combination of osteoclast and osteoblast activity on mineralized bone. Okay, mechanical stress is going to have an impact on bone strength. Stress causes bone remodeling to increase bone density and align the trabeculae along the stress lines. And this is simply so that it can support the applied force without fracturing. The changes are caused by increased or decreased osteoblast activity depending on where the stress is, and this is going to allow the bone to respond appropriately to the reapplied force. Remember the slide that we were looking at earlier of the coronal section through the femur that showed the stress lines in the spongy bone lining up basically where the body weight sits on the proximal head of the femur and is translated all the way down the medial longitudinal aspect inside the spongy bone. You could see those stress lines very, very clearly. Now, bone repair is an important process. Essentially, what happens in bone repair is that the process of osteogenesis, in particular endochondral ossification, is mimicked to some extent in the area where the bone's been fractured. It starts with hematoma formation, and that's basically internal bleeding that is going to occur across where the break is located. the mass of blood that's released from the vessels is confined inside the organ or space, and we see the formation of a clot. You have to remember that living bone is encased in a membrane. Okay, the periosteum and the endosteum sort of restrict where the blood goes. Callus formation follows. This is a massive tissue that forms where the fracture is located and connects the broken ends of the bone. The callus initially is very soft, and it slowly begins to mineralize and eventually gets remodeled so that the bone looks like it did prior to the break. Um, in internal callus formation, the blood vessels grow into the clot in the hematoma. The macrophages, of course, clean out the dead cells. The osteoclasts break down the tissue, and the fibroblasts generate the collagen in the granulation tissue that's going to serve as the meshwork around which eventually the mineralized bone is going to be deposited. The chondroblasts form endochondral progenitors that are located again in the periosteum, which is going to be near where the break's located, as well as in the endosteum, and they're going to generate cartilage within the collagen. So we start, just like we did in the embryonic skeleton, with a cartilage model. The osteoblasts then invade and they choke off nutrients to the osteoclasts. They end up dying off, and the cartilaginous matrix slowly gets replaced by ossified tissue. On the external side of the callus, the collar around the opposing ends is formed. The periosteal osteochondral progenitors give way to the osteoblasts and the chondroblasts. The bone cartilage collar then stabilizes the two pieces. And just remember back to the video that we saw on endochondral ossification. Remember that it's the formation of that outer layer of bone, that thin outer layer of compact bone, that chokes off blood supply to the chondroblasts and eventually causes them to die off, the cartilage to disappear, and then the osteoblasts invade and lay down the mineralized matrix. The callus is then replaced by woven spongy bone. The replacement of the spongy bone and the damaged material by compact bone is the remodeling phase, and this happens as a result of a combination both of osteoclast and osteoblast activity. What the osteoclasts tear down, the osteoblasts redeposit in a manner that's going to essentially reform the bone the way it was prior to the break. And so what we're going to look at here is just a little video talking about bone repair, so take a listen.
We zoom from this cross-section of fractured bone to a close-up view of the outer surface of the bone. After fracture, blood vessels in the bone and in the surrounding soft tissues tear and bleed into the fracture line and form a hematoma. Necrotic bone tissue adjacent to the fracture releases messengers that cause an intense inflammatory response, exudation and migration of macrophages, monocytes, lymphocytes, and fibroblasts to the fracture site. This is known as the inflammatory phase. Fibroblasts lay down a fibrin stroma or meshwork in the hematoma, allowing and aiding the development of new capillary penetration and granulation tissue, while phagocytes begin to ingest cell debris as part of the fracture line cleanup. Chondroblasts start to lay down a cartilaginous matrix, and osteoblasts migrate to both edges of the fracture line and produce collagen fibers that eventually connect across the fracture. An osteoid is secreted along the cartilaginous matrix and then start to mineralize, forming a soft callus. This is known as the repair phase. Osteoblasts continue to proliferate and produce collagen fibers and a spongy bone matrix, which bridges the fracture line and fills the swelling at the edge of the fracture, forming a bony callus. Osteoclasts then migrate into the repair site and start to dissolve and remove excess bone from the callus. In response to mechanical and electrical forces, osteoclasts and osteoblasts in concert remodel the callus so that the edges of the callus line up with the original edges of the fractured bone. This is known as the remodeling phase.
Okay, now one of the major building blocks of bone is of course calcium, primarily in the form of calcium phosphate and carbonate. As a result, the skeletal system is a major mineral storehouse, not just for calcium phosphate and carbonate, but also for quite a few other minerals that are used as cofactors in enzymatic reaction. The level of calcium in the blood depends upon the movement of calcium into or out of the bone. Calcium enters the bone when the osteoblasts generate the new bone. They steal the calcium from the blood. The calcium leaves the bone when the osteoclasts dissolve it at those resorption bays that are on the surface of the compact bone. The two hormones that control these levels are parathyroid hormone and calcitonin. And the way that I always remember this is that calcitonin puts the tone in the bone. Let's write that down here as a way to remember. Let's use blue here, right? And we'll say puts the tone in the bone. And parathyroid hormone does the opposite. Parathyroid hormone elevates blood calcium by dissolving bone. So it stimulates osteoclast activity. It also stimulates increased absorption of calcium and phosphate from the GI, and it also recovers calcium at the kidneys. Okay, so several targets for parathyroid hormone. And in case you're wondering, the parathyroid gland is located on the back of the thyroid gland, which is located right in front of your larynx, just a little bit below where the Adam's apple is in men. And there's usually between 2 to 4 parathyroid glands per individual. Sometimes what can happen is that the parathyroid gland can kind of lose its mind and oversecrete parathyroid hormone, and this leads to early onset osteoporosis, which is often revealed by pathologic fracture, where the bone normally wouldn't break under a certain amount of applied force, but in the case of the softened, the weakened bone, the brittle bone, that's the hallmark of osteoporosis, easily shatters. So this is just a look at calcium homeostasis. We can see here decreased blood calcium stimulates PTH production, which stimulates increased blood calcium levels through stimulating osteoclast activity, increased absorption of calcium from the GI, and increased recovery of calcium by the kidneys. Let's see, vitamin D, another very important factor, right? That's made by the UV action of the sun's rays on the skin, along with the role of the kidneys and the liver in generating the active component of vitamin D. It promotes calcium absorption from the small intestine and into the blood. Increased blood calcium levels stimulate calcitonin secretion, and that's generated by the thyroid gland. There are 3 hormones made by the thyroid gland. Calcitonin is one that regulates calcium, and then thyroxine and T3, which goes by the longer name of triiodothyronine, elevate the body's basal metabolic rate. And those are unusual hormones in the sense that they are amino acid derivatives, but they're relatively non-polar. Okay? The calcitonin inhibits the osteoclast and allows for enhanced osteoblast uptake of the calcium, and this gets deposited into the bone and the bone density goes up. Okay, this is just a little look at bone fractures, so take a listen.
The skeletal system is made up of 206 bones and provides support, allows for movement, and protects the internal organs of the body. Sometimes too much pressure is applied to a bone that results in what is known as a fracture. Fractures are often classified as either open or closed. An open fracture is a fracture where a piece of the broken bone pierces through the skin. This can be dangerous because the bone is exposed, increasing the risk of infection. A closed fracture is a fracture where the bone is broken but does not come through the skin. A compression fracture is a closed fracture that occurs when 2 or more bones are forced against each other. It commonly occurs to bones of the spine and may be caused by falling into a standing or sitting position or a result of advanced osteoporosis. An avulsion fracture is a closed fracture where a piece of bone is broken off by a sudden forceful contraction of a muscle. This type of fracture is common in young athletes and can occur when muscles are not properly stretched before activity. This fracture can also be a result of an injury. An impacted fracture is similar to a compression fracture, yet it occurs within the same bone. It is a closed fracture that occurs when pressure is applied to both ends of the bone, causing it to split into two fragments that jam into each other. This type of fracture is common in falls and car accidents. All fractures must be taken seriously. If you think that a bone has been fractured, you should seek immediate medical attention.
Okay, some other bone fractures that we should touch on. Incomplete fractures don't extend across the bone where complete fractures do. So in an incomplete fracture, part of the bone will be intact and then you'll have a crack on the other side. In a green stick fracture, we have an incomplete fracture that occurs on the convex side of the curve of a bone, while a hairline fracture is an incomplete fracture where two sections of the bone fail to separate. This is common, for instance, in skull fractures, being hit with a blunt instrument, for instance. Comminuted fractures are complete breaks into more than two pieces, so the ends of the bone shatter a bit. They can also classify fractures based on the direction of the fracture. They can be linear, meaning they parallel to the long axis. They can be transverse, which means they're perpendicular to the long axis. Spiral, oblique, meaning they occur at an angle to the long axis of the bone. Dentate, meaning that they have a sort of jagged end. And then stellate, which means that they radiate out from a central point. And what you're looking at here are just some visuals of some different bone fractures. You can see here an example of a linear and a complete and an incomplete fracture, a comminuted and a transverse fracture. There's a spiral and an oblique, and if you look here, there's an epiphyseal fracture right at the epiphyseal plate. So the cartilage again represents a weak point in the bone, and if we apply undue force, we can cause a break. And again, in order for these to heal properly, they have to be what we call reduced. What that means is that we have to set the ends of the bone so that they knit properly. The other thing to understand about fractures is that they can either be open or closed, as you learned in the video. In a closed fracture, the broken bone is entirely inside the skin, okay, inside the soft tissue, and is not exposed to the external environment. In an open fracture, the jagged ends of the bone erupt through the skin, and the danger, of course, there is that we can have infection in the bone, and this can set the stage for sepsis and then for multiple organ failure. Okay, this is just a look at some diseases and disorders of the skeletal system. So this is table 6.3 in your book. Star this and know this material. It may show up on a PRS quiz in the future. And this is simply a video on osteoporosis. So let's take a listen.
Bone is living tissue. Bone building is far from complete when a baby is born. During growth, from infancy to adulthood, bone is increased in size, strength, and hardness. Also, in different parts of the body, bones grow at different rates. Bone growth is partly in response to stresses that are put on the bone by weight-bearing motion. The simple acts of walking, running, jumping, and lifting heavy objects put strain on bones that results in increased bone density. Trabecular bone is found in the shaft and at the ends of the long bones, inside the spinal vertebrae, and inside the flat bones of the pelvis. In the ends, trabecular bone completely fills the cavity, and its structure transmits stress forces to the shaft. Trabecular bone forms an internal scaffolding network for bone. The trusses and arches found within the trabecular bone provide for the great strength of bone and yet surprising lightness. The arches and trusses inside trabecular bone provide a sponge-like appearance in the bone and also create the opportunity for blood vessels to penetrate the bone structure from the center core, marrow, of the long bone. Bone remodeling is such a thorough process that one's entire bone structure is replaced approximately every 10 years. Once maturity is reached, about age 30, the process of remodeling slows and the loss of bone calcium deposits exceeds the replacement of the bone structure. Beyond this point, it is no longer possible to substantially increase bone density. Over time, the density of the arches and trusses diminishes, and the spaces between them become larger. This process leads to a general weakening of the bone structure. It is a very gradual process and requires decades before any noticeable bone weakness appears. Osteoporosis is the end result of the erosion of the arches and trusses. Osteoporotic bone has much larger spaces between the arches and trusses and is significantly weaker than normal bone. Therefore, it is more prone to fracture. This condition is responsible for many injuries related to falls in elderly people. Women are more susceptible to osteoporosis than men. This is probably related to hormonal influence on bone growth and calcification. Also, dietary intake of calcium and other nutrients, including protein, phosphorus, vitamin A, vitamin D, vitamin K, magnesium, zinc, and copper will influence bone density, in that deficiencies will cause decreases. Finally, genetics have an influence on bone density. Here is the progress of bone loss in a person who has taken some precautions related to osteoporosis onset. Note that as the aging process continues, the rate of erosion of the trabecular structure has slowed, and the end result at age 70 is bone that is stronger and denser than a bone with severe osteoporosis. Strategies for preventing osteoporosis are different for young women and older women. Young women should be sure to meet their needs for calcium, vitamin D, and other nutrients. Physical activity of a weight-bearing nature is also important to maintain bone mass. In postmenopausal women, estrogens, estrogen receptor modulators, and calcitonin can slow bone turnover by binding to bone receptors. Calcium supplementation and regular exercise, especially weight-bearing and resistance activities, are important strategies for older people. Finally, since both tobacco smoking and alcohol consumption have negative effects on bone growth, these behaviors should be avoided for healthy bones. In summary, osteoporosis, the weakening of bones due to loss of calcium and phosphorus from the interior of the bone architecture, is a degenerative disease that is influenced by many contributing factors. Health-promoting interventions such as adequate nutrition and physical activity, and medical interventions such as prescription medications designed to limit progress of osteoporosis, coupled with positive behaviors such as not smoking or using alcohol excessively, can forestall the onset and severity of osteoporosis. Men are also at risk for developing osteoporosis. For men, similar prevention strategies apply. These include adequate calcium, vitamin D, and other nutrients, physical activity of a weight-bearing nature, and avoidance of behaviors like smoking and excessive alcohol consumption.
Okay, now, as with any other body system, the skeletal system tends to degrade with age. And the reason for this is the death of osteocytes, osteoblasts, and osteoclasts. What results is a decrease in the amount of bone matrix. It becomes more brittle due to the lack of collagen, but there's also less hydroxyapatite. The bone mass decreases. It's at its peak around 30 years of age. Men's bones are denser due to the effects of testosterone and usually a higher body weight. African Americans and Hispanics have higher bone masses than Caucasians and Asians. This is probably genetic in origin. The rate of bone loss increases tenfold after menopause, due primarily to the loss of estrogen, which is the result of the depletion of follicles in the ovary that takes place on a monthly basis from a female's first menstrual period, which is menarche, until her last menstrual period, which is, of course, menopause. Spongy bone is lost first, and then compact bone is lost, and so very often what we'll do is engage in hormone replacement therapy, HRT, in order to try and shore up bone density in postmenopausal women, although that therapy has come under some controversy in recent years. We also see increased risk of bone fracture, and the reason for that, again, is the loss in bone density. Bone loss can cause deformity and, of course, a reduction in height because of the applied force to the softening bone, causing it to compress. We also see a lot of stiffness. Very often we'll see a stooped posture, a hunchback, kyphotic kind of posture that is characteristic of osteoporosis, particularly in the vertebral column. And we'll also see loss of teeth. And again, this is all due essentially to a reduction in the number of viable cells. There are fewer cells to build and remodel bone, there are fewer cells to repair injury, and as a result, when damage occurs, it heals much more slowly. Okay, that takes care of the back end of Chapter 6. Make sure and review this information as it will likely appear on a test or a quiz, and I'll see everybody in class. Thank you very much.